Why, hello there. Welcome back to the MMA Girl podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm, of course, Jess, the MMA Girl. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to my social medias where you're listening to this right now. Thank you very much for coming back and listening to another episode of the MMA Girl podcast. Today's episode is episode 19, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about. Honestly, this weekend's, of course, UFC Nashville event was insane. So much to unpack, but also there's just been so many things going on in the MMA world recently that I'm not going to be able to compact everything into one episode. I think I was going to do UFC Nashville, latest news, and UFC 318 in one episode, but I think I'm going to do a separate video for UFC 318. So for those listening on any kind of podcast platforms, go onto my YouTube channel for my video at the end of the week on UFC's 318 pay-per-view. I'll do my breakdown and my picks, of course, for the main card, as I usually do, because I won't be able to fit everything in this episode at all. So let's get cracking straight into it, shall we? So, right off the bat, Evloev versus Pico, which is supposed to be happening this month at UFC's Abu Dhabi card, headlined, of course, by Robert Whittaker and Derrick, unfortunately has been cancelled. That bout has been cancelled due to Evloev, again, Movsar Evloev, has unfortunately pulled out of this fight because he has been injured again. Now, statistically, this is very bad for Evloev because a lot of people are arguing his case for him to get a title shot against Alexander Volkanovski, but I can see exactly why the UFC are holding up on giving him a title shot, because he's basically more likely to pull out of a fight than not pull out of a fight. He's worse than any kind of Chimaev or anyone that you know that pulls out of fights often. Evloev is probably the worst fight puller outer of the whole of the UFC. He has had a total of 9 fights at the UFC and 11 UFC fights cancelled. So he could be at 20 fights at the UFC if it wasn't for the fact that he cancelled all of these bouts. But unfortunately, this bout, like many others before, has been cancelled. So my hopes initially, when I saw this announcement, of course, I was very sad to see that these guys weren't going to be having it on at UFC Abu Dhabi, but I was hoping that they'd find someone for Aaron Pico late notice so that he could have his UFC debut as it was planned. But because Pico's coming from Bellator and because his first initial fight was going to be a huge one, of course, against Movsar Evloev, it's not an easy challenge at all whatsoever. I think the UFC wanted to give him someone as big as Evloev, so they may cancel this fight altogether and reschedule it for later on in the year. And I think that's what's going to happen, because we've had no word yet on whether it's just been cancelled and delayed or whether they're trying to find a replacement for Evloev. But I think they're probably going to wait and see if Evloev gets better soon. We don't know what he's got, what kind of injury he sustained, but they also might find someone else but not have the fight at short notice, because they want this to be a real planned, scheduled bout that both guys have a full camp for. I think maybe for Aaron Pico this may be a bit disturbing because he, of course, was probably excited for his new adventure in the UFC, but unfortunately your new adventure in the UFC has been put on the sidebar for now. I'm sorry, Pico. I was excited to see him. I think they were saying Evloev hasn't had 2 consecutive fights without a fight being cancelled between each of his fights, and that's just crazy for a UFC career. And it's crazy that the UFC are even putting up with that. I just don't know how on earth the UFC haven't cut him yet. But anyway, that's for them to do. All we know is that at UFC Abu Dhabi, we will not be getting Aaron Pico versus Movsar Evloev, unfortunately. And this explains a lot why we are not giving Evloev a title shot against Volkanovski and rather giving it to Yair Rodriguez, for example. And, of course, Diego Lopez. So, next up, we have BKFC. There's a lot of news surrounding BKFC. I don't know if you guys watch BKFC's fights. I try to tune into their pay-per-views every once in a while when I can. Of course, sometimes their pay-per-views are slap bang at the same time as UFC cards, or sometimes I've stayed up all night to watch UFC's cards. I just don't want to continue staying up until 10 a.m. in the morning on Sunday to watch BKFC, or sometimes on the Friday and I have to prioritize, of course, Saturday night UFC. I work on Saturday, so that's not possible. But anyway, when I can watch BKFC, I do try and tune in. Now, what has been announced recently, a few things have been announced, of course, but what has been announced recently at the latest press conference where Conor McGregor, of course, had his time on the mic, was that each and every fighter on the roster that had at least 10 fights with BKFC and was an active fighter only signed to BKFC will be getting equity in the company. So they'll all be getting shares of the company and earning more money on top of course, their contracts for each fight, thanks to this new equity they're getting. And this was a decision probably made by the BKFC president and Conor McGregor, which I find really cool. So, he can pat himself on the back for that. BKFC have also announced they've signed former UFC stars Thiago Santos, Derrick Brunson, and Yoel Romero. Yoel Romero, of course, coming off of a victory at the first Dirty Boxing pay-per-view that had taken place. He, of course, was in the headlining main event, and he KO'd his opponent in the first round. Of course, now fighting at heavyweight for now. Yoel, I'm not sure whether he'll be fighting at heavyweight at BKFC, but that would be cool to see as well. At almost 50 years old now, he is just crazy good, and he's not, of course, at UFC level now. Of course, we don't know that, I'm just assuming, but he's, of course, moved around different promotions since leaving the UFC, but he's always shown that he will get his victories wherever it is, no matter how hard it is to get. So Yoel Romero, Derrick Brunson, and Thiago Santos are all signed to BKFC alongside female superstar Aspinall, who is also signed for BKFC. So their next event will be probably a huge deal, and I recommend you guys tune in. Another signing to BKFC, which is not a new signing but a re-signing, is Mike Perry. Now, I'm not one to hide on my social media that I'm very much a big fan of Mike Perry. I love his banter. I love how he is. I feel like he's so funny. He brings life into the MMA community, and I love what he's doing with Dirty Boxing, which, of course, as you guys know, has been invested in by none other than Jon Jones. So Jon Jones has been present for both the first and second Dirty Boxing events, which is why it came kind of a surprise to me that Mike Perry would re-sign with BKFC, because I thought, if anything, if he wanted to get back into fighting, that would be through his own company, Dirty Boxing, not through BKFC, who, when Conor took over, fired him. And I didn't like, I'm going to be honest, the press conference, because when Mike Perry was announced to be re-signed with BKFC and he was able to do his face-to-face, etc., with his next opponent, beforehand, Conor made some quite startling remarks in my eyes. Of course, I'm not going to go on the whole Conor train. I have things to say about Conor McGregor today, which is unlike me, but anyway. I didn't like the way he was talking to Mike Perry. Of course, if Mike Perry's signed over there and he's willing to put up with the kind of language that Conor is using against him or for him, then that's his problem, because, of course, sometimes for $1, we're capable of being belittled like that and not take it seriously. But I really did not feel comfortable watching Conor basically saying, you're going to dance for me and I'm going to decide if you deserve another contract. I found that quite belittling of Mike Perry, someone who has created his own promotion, which is doing very well. I don't see why he needs to come back to BKFC to be treated in this way. Maybe for him, he needs to come back because he wants to fight again, and BKFC is a great place to fight. I won't deny that, but I just felt like Mike Perry is beyond that now. And when I heard Conor saying all those things, I was like, Mike is just looking at him. You could tell that Mike was saying to himself, I do not like how he's talking to me, but I'm going to have to close my mouth because he is the joint president of BKFC now. And if I want to keep my position here, I'm going to have to accept that he speaks to me like this. But why, Mike? You don't need BKFC to be relevant. You just don't. But anyway, that's what he's putting up with right now. Speaking of Mike Perry, also, he recently said that he'd love to re-sign with the UFC as well, which clearly makes him someone who is not one to keep grudges. That's what I want to say. Because, of course, going back to BKFC after being fired by Conor McGregor, and he wants to go back to UFC after being fired by the UFC as well, because he would like to replace Michael Chandler, in a fight against Conor McGregor. So I think that kind of foreshadows the fact that he won't be sticking around very long at BKFC. He knows that he won't put up with the way Conor's talking to him for very much longer. And I think that this could be a nice storyline to show that Mike Perry has accepted some of the behavior that Conor McGregor is throwing his way, but he wouldn't accept it for too long. And I hope that if one day the UFC re-sign Mike Perry, which is very unlikely, maybe a Mike Perry versus Conor McGregor fight at the White House would be great. But I doubt, even if Dana White was okay with it, I doubt that Conor would be okay with fighting a Mike Perry at the UFC's White House card, seeing as he wanted a huge fight, mega fight, either co-main or main event. So I don't see Mike Perry getting that at all, but we'll see. Regarding the White House card, we have, of course, Jon Jones, as I said, who is very hyped up, very excited to also be a part of the White House card. And he has said that he would like a fight against Tom Aspinall. But now he is, as he said last time, now he is the hunter and not the hunted. So he doesn't need to feel like the pressure is on to answer the questions, to answer the calls and say, yes, I accept this and that and the other. Now he has, basically Dana White said that as soon as he heard about the White House's card, Jon Jones, he said exactly, it's happening and it's going to be the best, biggest super fight in UFC history. So I think he's pertaining to Tom Aspinall versus Jon Jones being the biggest fight that could have been made this year that didn't happen, that could have been made last year that didn't happen either, because we got instead at Madison Square Garden, Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic, which should never have happened in the first place. But if we get Tom Aspinall versus Jon Jones next year, then that is just a hand-gifted fight to Jon Jones that he has hand-picked for the White House. But we may not get Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall, because maybe he's saying that it's going to be the biggest fight in UFC history just because we're going to see Jon Jones back in the octagon at the White House, no less. But I don't think that. I think that if we see Jon Jones back in the octagon at the White House, he will probably take on Tom Aspinall and we'll be able to see what happens. And I think maybe he's saying to himself, listen, if I lose this fight, at least I've lost this fight for the American people, in front of the American people at the White House itself. So maybe that's why he's not too bothered by the fact that he may lose against Tom Aspinall in the first place. But who knows? I'm not doubting Jon Jones's skills. I think he has what it takes to beat Tom Aspinall, but I think Tom Aspinall also has what it takes to beat a Jon Jones. So I think really, in my opinion, it depends who turns up on that day and what kind of version of each guy turns up on that day and gets the job done. But both guys are capable of beating each other. So it's just a question of how and who wins, because it could go either way, I think. So a lot of the upcoming UFC events like UFC 320, UFC 321, UFC 322, UFC Noche have been, of course, rumored to have certain huge fights coming up. And I'm going to go through all of those and see what you guys think of those. So a UFC 320 on October 4th, because supposedly, this is just rumors for now, we're getting 2 pay-per-views in 1 month. We're getting 2 numbered cards in the month of October. So the first UFC 320 event happening in October is the October 4th card, which apparently will be featuring Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya 2. A couple of months ago, Israel did express his wish to come back to the octagon against Sean Strickland to show him, to punish him basically for some of the words he was saying and to get his own back for the loss he was submitted to by Sean Strickland. And of course, that was for the belt. So, of course, he lost his belt to Sean Strickland in that fight. So, even though Sean's no longer the champion, Israel wants to get his own back on Sean Strickland in a second bout between both guys. And it's potentially happening on October 4th at UFC 320. We're apparently also getting Merab versus Corey Sanhagen for the UFC bantamweight title at UFC 320. This is, of course, rumors for now. This is all alleged. And we are, of course, maybe getting also Yaya Rodriguez versus Alexander Volkanovski 2 for the featherweight belt. Now, if the bouts are all going to happen on UFC's UFC 320 card, we're probably going to be getting Yaya versus Volk as the main event, Merab versus Corey as the co-main, and maybe just the third featured bout, Israel Adesanya Strickland. But I doubt we're getting those 3 bouts on the same night. I doubt it. It would be amazing. Maybe the UFC are going to give us some real cool fight cards, even though they're really cool already, but even better fight cards for the upcoming numbered cards. But I would be still very surprised that we get those 3 bouts. But that's what's rumored for now. For UFC 321, which is supposedly happening on October 25th this year, we will be getting potentially Ankalaev versus Pereira 2 for the UFC light heavyweight belt, of course. Now, that's happening because apparently Yuri Prohaska was proposed to fight Ankalaev this summer, but had his exams to do, which I didn't really get if he'd failed or passed the exams, but he's finished those exams and will be fighting very soon. Now, they're proceeding with Pereira versus Ankalaev 2. And after Pereira versus Ankalaev 2, the winner will probably face Joe Prochazka because there's no other kind of options at light heavyweight for now. Also on the card, potentially, probably, maybe, allegedly, we're getting Tom Aspinall versus Cyril Gane for the UFC's undisputed heavyweight title. And this guy's could be a huge card. If we get Aspinall versus Gane as the main event for the UFC undisputed heavyweight championship belt, and then as co-main, Ankalaev versus Alex Pereira for the light heavyweight belt, that would be an insane fight. No, I would just, even if they put just complete cans as the rest of the main card, if you like, I would just be insanely happy if that happened on the same night. Again, I don't think this is going to happen on the same night. This is going to be a very expensive fight card for the UFC to pay all four of those huge names. But UFC's October 25th card at UFC 321 is happening in Abu Dhabi in any case. And if it's featuring one of these two bouts, it will be insane in any way. So would you guys like to see those kinds of bouts coming up in a few months? And are you guys looking forward to the end of the year? Because there are some real cool bouts that are scheduled from September onwards. Speaking of which, at UFC Noche in September, we are getting quite a few bouts that I've already announced. Of course, John Silva versus Diego Lopez being the main event. And apparently, they may add Moreno versus Royval to the as co-main or just featured bout on the card for UFC Noche as well. This is, of course, a rumor for now, but we may be getting Royval versus Moreno too. I feel like probably it's not the same for all divisions, but I feel like for the flyweight division right now, there are a lot of fights we're getting 2 or 3 repeated bouts because they're the same people in the same top 5 pool of fighters. And, of course, Moreno falling short against Pantoja, as well as Royval falling short against Pantoja, makes them the number 2 and number 3 ranked flyweight contenders who, of course, deserve title shots, but in the meantime can also have fights for number 1 contender spot. And of course, we know Joshua Van has moved up to number 1 contender. So the next fight we're seeing for the UFC's flyweight belt will be Pantoja versus Joshua Van. But in the meantime, the rest of the top 5 need obviously to fight to determine the new rankings, if there are any. But I just feel like we're seeing the same fighters all over again every time. But that's what's going to happen because the top 5 hasn't really moved, apart from Joshua Van being moved up to number 1 spot. We've not seen the top 5 really vary that much. You know, you've got Romano Cap, Royval, Moreno. Now we've got Joshua Van, Steve Erceg, Kai Kara France. The same kind of names we've been hearing for the last while. But that's not a bad thing. I hope that between Royval and Moreno, when they will be fighting each other one day, even if it's not a UFC Noche, we'll be able to determine the new, once again, number 1 contender for the flyweight belt. At UFC 322, which is happening in November at Madison Square Garden, or at least for now, it's planned for Madison Square Garden in New York, we may be getting, now this is the biggest fight that I've heard rumors about, we may be getting Justin Gaethje versus Ilia Topuria. Of course, Ilia Topuria being the current lightweight champion, and Gaethje thinking he deserves a next title drop, or the next title drop, shot over the number 1 contender Arman Tsarukyan and the number 1 storyline contender Paddy Pimblett. And of course, we spoke about this on my last episode. Paddy Pimblett doesn't deserve it in terms of his ranking, but there's a huge beef between Ilia Topuria and Paddy Pimblett, so it's the most logical conclusion for the next fight, and even Ilia Topuria really wants this fight. But number 1 contender is Arman Tsarukyan, and Justin Gaethje, number 3 ranked lightweight contender, so he does deserve a fight, of course, Justin Gaethje, but does he deserve it before Arman Tsarukyan? I don't think so, but as we saw, the UFC do tend to hold grudges, and Arman Tsarukyan still is on the back burner for now. Arman Tsarukyan, meanwhile, of course, helping Chimaev with his training camp for next month's UFC 319 main event against DDP. But we're not hearing any fight announcements for Arman Tsarukyan, and he isn't one to stick around where he's not welcome. So I hope the UFC are able to schedule him, even for a number 1 contenders fight. I think he'd accept any of these fights because he's up to anything. But for now, Gaethje versus Ilia is the targeted fight, apparently, for Madison Square Garden in November. So that will be cool if it happens, but we'll see if it's announced in the next coming months. Going on to a little bit of bad news regarding PFL's featherweight champion, who is currently undefeated, of course, Timur Khizriev, unfortunately has been ambushed just in front of his home in Dagestan by two masked individuals who came and ambushed him and shot him with rubber bullets. Now, of course, there were no fatal injuries because they were rubber bullets, but he had some very serious damage and is currently undergoing surgery as we speak. Now, that's really hard to hear, causing serious damage to a champion of the PFL's featherweight division for we don't know what reason, but it seems to me there's no reason to do something like that apart from sabotaging someone. But I'm not going to accuse anyone of anything, of course. But that's just really sad to hear. But I just want to send all my thoughts and prayers out to Timur and his family. Thoughts and prayers with them. I'm sure he'll pull through, of course. There's no fatal injuries to his body right now. Just hopefully the surgery will go well and he'll be able to get back into training as soon as possible. And yeah, just hoping that everyone is all right on his side of things. Very sad to hear that kind of stuff happening in the MMA world, because the MMA community is like a big family. And when you're part of it, even as a fan or a member of the media or a fighter or anyone in the MMA community, we all tend to feel the shockwave of events like this happening upon all of us. So it's very sad to hear that. Speaking of which, of course, we had Ben Askren coming on social media last week, giving us an update on his health condition and his double lung transplant. And he, of course, looked in very bad shape. We know Ben Askren, he's retired now, so he's full, he's looking good. And in his video on his hospital bed, that was quite shocking to watch. And for some people, I think it must have been maybe too hard to watch even to see him in that condition. But he's keeping his hopes up. He republished another video 3 or 4 days after that video, and he looked much better. And so I'm very happy to hear that Ben Askren is doing well and recovering slowly but surely, and he'll maybe be out of hospital in the next few weeks. But for now, everything's going well. Of course, having a double lung surgery, I can't speak from experience, luckily for me, but I think it's a very, very heavy surgery to have done on oneself. So even after recovery has been completed, I think the road to being healthy at 100% is very long. So I wish Ben Askren and his family, of course, also a speedy recovery and a nice recovery, and I hope he gets back to work as soon as he feels better. Regarding that situation, however, I've been seeing for the last 3 or 4 weeks that Jake Paul, even maybe longer, Jake Paul has been heavily criticised in the UFC and Dana White in particular for the fact that apparently no money had been given from the UFC or from Dana White himself to Ben Askren to pay his heavy medical bills, because Ben Askren had recently, or maybe his wife had recently said that the insurance company, they are fully insured, of course, for medical services, had refused to pay for his double lung transplant because it's a hugely expensive operation. But that's the kind of the point of having health insurance. They're supposed to cover your health bills. So when and upon hearing that the insurance company refused to pay Ben's double lung transplant, Jake Paul took it upon himself to announce he was making it a $500,000 donation to Ben Askren for his speedy recovery and, of course, to help pay for his medical bills. And he highlighted, of course, whilst saying that he donated $500K, that the UFC is staying silent on the Ben Askren matter and that they are not showing any signs of donating or helping to pay for the surgery. Now, this weekend, of course, we'll talk about UFC Nashville in a minute, but this weekend, Dana White came on at the post-fight press conference for UFC Nashville and was asked about that specifically. And he said, no, I paid for Ben Askren's surgery. So however much the double lung transplant cost, Dana White fitted the bill. So whether or not you hear someone like Dana White or anyone from the UFC shouting at the top of a building, we just paid for Ben Askren's surgery, doesn't mean that wasn't done. It doesn't mean it was done either. But I think Jake Paul was a little bit quick to jump to conclusions, of course, always wanting to criticize Dana White, especially the UFC president and the UFC in general. But jumping to conclusions quickly just because we're not hearing anything from him doesn't mean that behind the scenes, Dana White isn't paying for things for former UFC stars like Ben Askren. And I think that when it comes to life and death situations and someone as treasured in the MMA community as Ben Askren is, I don't think that Dana White would have thought twice than to donate and help pay fully for that operation. And he has confirmed, Dana White, on Saturday night that he fully paid for Ben's double lung transplant. So there's no way we can say that Jake Paul is correct in saying that the UFC are silent on the matter. kudos to Jake Paul for his donation of 500k, because of course the surgery was expensive, but the aftercare and everything that comes with it is of course also very expensive. So those donations, any kind of donation like that, will of course come in handy. But we mustn't jump to conclusions and say the UFC never donated or helped Ben Askren, because they have helped Ben Askren enormously, and they will continue doing so as much as he needs it, I think. So never underestimate Dana White. Just because he doesn't boast about helping someone, he doesn't mean he didn't. So Jake Paul, let's continue on Jake Paul, because then we can get out of the way. Jake Paul has confirmed apparently that a fight between himself and Anthony Joshua is definitely 100% going to happen next year. Now, they're not at all in the same category, and as far as I can tell, Jake Paul is much smaller than AJ in terms of his height. Let's not even get onto weight. So the fact that AJ would have agreed to that, that's kind of a surprise to me. But according to Jake Paul, that is what has been agreed upon, and we're going to be getting AJ versus JK next year. With what promotion, I don't know. I don't think they'll be passing by Eddie Hearn, because Eddie Hearn, I don't think, has much love for Jake Paul. But that's apparently the rumor that Jake Paul is coming out with at the moment, that Anthony Joshua is apparently willing to fight him. That would be a surprise to me, because Anthony Joshua takes himself at least a little bit seriously. So I would be shocked to hear that he would agree upon that. But we'll be seeing in the coming few months or next year whether that fight is announced. But for now, we're focusing on, of course, Usyk versus Dubois, which is happening, of course, on July 19th. And I'm very excited for that fight. Next up, just a quickie on Bilal Muhammad, who recently came out with a statement that made me made me giggle quite a lot anyway. He said that if he were to start MMA all over again from the very beginning, he would, as Islam Makhachev says to a lot of people, he would have gone to Dagestan for 2 or 3 years and left his family to forget about him whilst he was in Dagestan. And I think that goes to show that he, of course, trains and works a lot with Khabib and Islam and all the Khabib camp. But he may regret currently the decision he made to continue training in America when he was younger, because he may have been a better fighter. That's what he's suggesting, I guess. He may have been a better fighter if he'd gone to Dagestan for 2 or 3 years instead of staying in the US. So that's what I have to say on that matter. A lot of people say that it's a good idea to go to Dagestan for 2 or 3 years and come back when you're ready to fight, either in the UFC or in MMA or in the Olympics doing wrestling or sambo. But he may have a point. He may have a point, because Bilal's a very, very complete fighter, great on the feet as he's great on the ground, but he's an all-round good fighter, but he's not an all-round excellent fighter. There's a difference. And I think that he may himself understand that, seeing as he lost to Jack Della Maddalena, who is not good on the ground. He's been working, of course, with Craig Jones to get better on the ground, but he's an amazing striker. Bilal can't say to himself, I'm an amazing striker and an amazing grappler, because he may be a better grappler than he is a striker, but in both areas, he's not amazing. And maybe that's what he's regretting now, because he's at the tail end of his career at 37 years old. Maybe he's saying to himself, I should have gone to Dagestan, because I would have been an amazing fighter on the ground as I am on the feet. Maybe. If you guys tune into any other podcasts apart from my own, then you may have seen that Demetrius Johnson, Mighty Mouse, has came out with an episode of his latest podcast with DC, Daniel Cormier, and the episode is less than an hour, I think. It didn't seem too long, but a really good watch. Honestly, I loved watching DJ and DC. A real must-watch episode. This episode in particular has some real good stories, and he gives his two-piece on everything. Daniel Cormier is an open book. You can ask him whatever you want. And so that's just to tell you guys, go tune in to Mighty Mouse's Mighty Cast episode with DJ. Who am I to say that you are not tuning into that if you're tuning into my podcast? But if you don't tune into the Mighty Cast, tune in, because the latest episode with Daniel Cormier is a must-watch. And speaking of podcasts, we also have the Pound for Pound podcast with Henry Cejudo and Kamaru Usman, which is a great watch as well. They recently had on the manager of every superstar at the UFC, Ali Abdelaziz, who came onto the podcast to spill some beans on some rumors, to talk about the past, to talk about everything he knows, everything he he was asked about, and he revealed, among other things, that the UFC have offered, because he is, of course, Kamaru Usman's manager also, he wouldn't have been on the podcast, I think, without him being one of the two's manager currently, but he currently manages a lot of the biggest stars at the UFC, including Islam Makhachev and Usman. And he said that in the past, the UFC wanted Israel Adesanya to fight Kamaru Usman, probably at middleweight, like Usman did against Chimaev. But Usman refused the fight, which was obvious because they're best friends, and it's just like Merab and Sterling. They prefer, even if it's missing a title shot, to not fight each other than fight each other. Like DC, for example, in the podcast episode with Demetrius Johnson, he revealed that he initially was a heavyweight fighter when he started his MMA career, but he moved down to light heavyweight because his best friend Cain Velasquez was at heavyweight and was the current heavyweight champion when he was becoming a good contender at the UFC. So he stayed at light heavyweight until Cain lost his belt, which makes sense because, of course, Cain's his best friend, so he didn't want to come up against him, which was exactly what happened with Merab and Aljamain Sterling. And, of course, with Israel and Usman, there was no belt on the line. Maybe at the time when the UFC offered a fight to Usman, it may have been for the belt whilst Israel was champion. But in either way, that would never happen because they're best friends and didn't want to fight each other. And I completely get it. And I think if Israel, maybe he's aware of this, of course, maybe he's not. But if Israel was offered the fight on his end, I think he would have refused it as well, which is obvious to me. Last bit of news before we move on to UFC Nashville's recap. Of course, we heard that Islam versus Ilia Topuria may or may not happen. But I think it will happen because Dana White has confirmed that if Islam Makhachev, when he goes up to welterweight and fights Jack Della Maddalena for the welterweight title, if Islam wins that fight and becomes double champion, as Ilia just became double champion, then he would be 100% down for a super fight between Ilia and Islam. So Dana White is confirming that's happening. Of course, Dana White can confirm what he wants, but whether or not that'll happen, that's another story. But at least we're getting confirmation that maybe Islam versus Ilia will happen in the end. Even if Ilia is not moving up to welterweight straight away, even if Islam has moved up to welterweight and not stayed at lightweight. So that's a really exciting matchup, and I really, really hope it happens. So let's go on to UFC Nashville. Of course, we're not going to go over everything that happened. I'm sure you guys watched attentively UFC Nashville on Saturday night, as I did. But it was just, as I said, as I predicted it to be, a banger card from start to finish, honestly. From the prelims to the main card, it was a great card. I think we had less decisions than we had finishes. Let's go over the bonuses first, however, because there were 3 bonuses given out. We had, of course, Landwehr versus Sharia, fight of the night bonus for both guys. I was a little bit surprised because I thought maybe that, of course, the fight of the night would not go to Derrick Lewis because 35 seconds is too little of a fight time to give him a fight of the night bonus. But I thought maybe there would be other fights that were contenders for the fight of the night status. For example, the second fight on the prelim card, Mitch Ramirez versus Mike Davis. That was a great fight. That was insane. Up until, of course, the second round KO for Mike Davis on Mitch Ramirez. That fight could have gone either way. Both guys were hitting real hard. Let me have a look at the stats. So we got 57 total strikes out of 118 attempted strikes from Ramirez to 58 total strikes out of the 94 attempted strikes from Mike Davis. You can obviously see Mitch Ramirez giving the most in this fight before he got knocked out, unfortunately for him. But over 2 rounds, I feel like the fight was really exciting to watch. So it did surprise me that Fight of the Night didn't go to this fight, but I think maybe, even though the bonuses went to individuals on the prelim card, maybe they didn't want to give Fight of the Night to a prelim fight as well. But in any case, the first fight of the night, of course, Fatima Klein versus Melissa Martinez, obviously finished in a KO in the 3rd round, and Fatima got her bonus of $50,000 for her performance of the night. And the second performance of the night was, of course, Valter Walker, who got the first round submission on Njoku via heel hook. And fun fact about Valter Walker is that the heel hook is his third submission in the UFC, and the third time that he has heel hook submitted someone at the UFC. So he's on a 3-fight win streak at the UFC, and all 3 bouts won at the UFC are by heel hook, and that is a record because no one in the UFC has ever done that. No one has won 3 consecutive fights via the same submission. So good work from Valter Walker. He's of course found his literal best move in submissions, and for a heavyweight to be submitting guys like that is very impressive. And a little fun fact to add on to that is that Tom Aspinall's very few losses on his record, one of them comes from a heel hook. Just saying. Just saying. But of course, Valter Walker said that he's not ready for a top 10 opponent in the heavyweight division. He wants to fight some of the top 15 guys before being plunged into the hot water with the top 10 guys. And I totally get it. Of course, a lot of people after seeing his performance against Njoku are saying, give him a top 10 guy, test him, see what he's like. But I think he's seen, of course, what happened to Thales Teixeira, who came out of a unranked position to fight the beast, Derrick Lewis, and of course lost in the first 35 seconds of the first round. So I think biting off too much, then more than you can chew, is not the best idea when it comes to working your way up in the rankings. And I think Valter knows that he has a lot to give and a lot to show to the UFC, but he's a young guy. He doesn't need to race his way to the top. I think Teixeira, we'll get onto that later, but I think Teixeira was way too young to be catapulted to a top 10 position against someone like Derrick Lewis, even though Derrick Lewis is, of course, 40 years old at the back end of his career. We could have seen a passing of the torch between Derrick Lewis and Thales Teixeira on this weekend, but we didn't. And I think that's because Thales Teixeira was way too young and it was too early in his career. So maybe Valter Walker is taking that into consideration and saying to himself, I have time. I don't need to rush in. I don't need to be catapulted to the top. I can take my time, get rid of some of these cans, work my way up the division naturally, and I'll get my title shot one day in the near future. And that's a very, I think, good decision to make. Anyway, so we got Fatima Klein with her bonus, Valter Walker with his bonus for their performances on the evening on the prelims card. We got some very good prelim fights, of course. As I said, Romero versus Mike Davis was a great prelim card fight, and that ended in the second round KO for Mike Davis, as I said. Njoku, Valter Walker, that ended in the first round. Lauren Murphy, of course, retiring after her last bout at UFC Nashville, unfortunately losing via decision to Eduarda Moura. Passing the torch, I wouldn't say entirely, but of course Moura was a favourite in this fight, and you could tell why. But Lauren Murphy put up a good fight and didn't get knocked out or submitted, so all respect to Lauren Murphy. As many people were saying on social media, they could have gone and done a highlight reel for her, highlighting the best moments of her career, as they did for all other people retiring, unless it was unexpected. This was a planned retirement. She had initially said this fight would be her last fight, so they had the time to put together at least a few clips of her best moments at the UFC, but unfortunately they didn't. So, but she got a good standout anyway, and good luck to Lauren Murphy for her future endeavours, of course. On the prelims, we also had Jake Matthews versus Njoku, who came up overweight at welterweight. He didn't make weight at all. It's not the first time he's not made weight. But despite this, he lost via submission in the first round, just over a minute, to Jake Matthews. So very good for Jake Matthews to get back in the win column. And for the last prelim we had on the card, of course, Chris Curtis versus Max Griffin, the featured ESPN prelim. And I was quite disappointed that it didn't finish as well, because we were on a finishing streak apart from Murphy versus Moura. So I was hoping that Chris Curtis versus Max Griffin would deliver a finish as well, but it was a good fight and good for Chris Curtis to be back in the win column. It was a tight one. It was close. So we, of course, had 6 bouts on the main card, starting off with Tokos versus Junior Taffa. I spoke about Junior Taffa last week because he had a transformation. This was his first fight at light heavyweight, and he looked much better. He looked trim, he looked tight, he looked muscly, he looked good. With all the less unnecessary baggage coming off of him, I thought we'd see an improved version of him. But to get submitted in the second round in that way was very disappointing to see. So for both Junior and Justin Taffa, there's a lot of work to be done, I think, before they come back into the octagon. Vitor Petrino, on the other hand, for the second bout of the main card, was moving up to heavyweight, and I was on the opposite end of things, a little concerned for him because I was scared that he wasn't going to be big enough. He was, of course, a lot smaller than Austin Lane. Bigger than I expected, however, because when we saw the height comparisons on photos, they seemed to be quite drastic, but in reality, they didn't look that much different. Of course, Austin Lane being very big, former American footballer, but their height difference wasn't as big as we imagined. And Vitor Petrino, he gained enough weight to look very good at heavyweight. He made 113 kilos, and he submitted, of course, Austin Lane in the first round, just over 4 minutes. What a performance from Vitor Petrino. I would have given him the bonus if I was Dana White, because not only did you submit someone that is much bigger than you, and you've moved up to heavyweight and beat your first opponent at heavyweight, but you are on the main card beating your opponent in the first round when this could have gone either way, honestly. Austin Lane, of course, missing out, of course, on some major skills in MMA to be able to fight off a Vitor Petrino who might have been smaller, but just so much more skilled than Austin Lane. And that just came to show in this fight, going just one round before he was submitted. And I would have given if I had the choice, I would have given the bonus to Vitor Petrino. But anyway, the Brazilian fighter Vitor Petrino, I don't know if he's planning on staying at heavyweight, but this fight may have encouraged him to do so. Then, of course, we had Nate Landwehr versus Morgan Sharia. That was a great fight. Of course, as I said, got performance of the night, fight of the night bonus for both guys. There were a little bit of, I wouldn't say animosity. There were a few words to exchange between Morgan and Landwehr, I think between the second and the third round. Of course, Morgan Sharia getting the third round KO over Landwehr. Beautifully done. This must mean now that Morgan can and will argue his case to be at UFC Paris in September, even though it will be a quick turnaround. Morgan spoke about it on his pre-fight interview that he loves fighting at Paris. The crowd's just nothing like in the other countries, and of course it's his home country, so he would love to be fighting in Paris on the 6th of September. So I hope for him that the 2-month turnaround will be, it's not even 2 months, like a month and a bit, or almost 2 months turnaround will be enough for him. But I think he'd do anything to fight at Paris in September. So great performance from him, great KO. But there was a bit of a conflict between both guys, and Morgan got his revenge in the third round. Landwehr having a bit of an attitude between the second and the third round during the break. So that's, taste your own medicine, Landwehr. Great on you, Morgan, for your victory. And of course, coming off of his loss at UFC London, he must be very happy. Then we had, of course, Calvin Kattar versus Garcia. I done my predictions for UFC Nashville, and I said that I thought Garcia would win this fight. It was important to take into consideration that even though Kattar, unfortunately, he's on a losing streak since 2022, he's not won a fight. And I said last week that Garcia has not lost a fight since 2022. He's won since 2022 up until now, and is continuing his win streak, of course. But Kattar is unfortunately continuing his losing streak since 2022. And despite being a loser, unfortunately, at this to this point, Kattar has never lost, or rarely lost, via KO or submission. He has mostly gone to a decision whilst losing his fights. So it's not a surprise to me that this fight also got up to a decision, because he's a tough cookie, Calvin Kattar. We need to put him up against someone a little bit easier than a Garcia, because Garcia is a very tough cookie, and he showed it on Saturday night. And I'm happy to see him in the win column again, because that would have been a real shame to stop his momentum at this point in time. But a good test for Garcia. So now Garcia, of course, can continue working up in the rankings of the featherweight division, and hopefully we'll see him in the top 5 in no time. For the co-main, we had, of course, Bonfim versus the Wonder Boy, Stephen Thompson. Unfortunately for Stephen Thompson, as I predicted correctly, he lost via decision over the 3 rounds against Gabriel Bonfim, of course, not his brother. It was quite an unsurprising result to the fight, but also a not so entertaining fight overall. Of course, I love watching these guys fight, but the difference of course, here were made by the takedowns, because Stephen Thompson landed way more significant strikes than Bonfim, but Bonfim was able to, out of the 14 takedown attempts that he made, was able to take down Stephen Thompson a total of 5 times, and Stephen, unfortunately, attempting 2 takedowns, didn't achieve any of those. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt from Bonfim, it's not surprising that he'd do better on the ground than Stephen Thompson, but Stephen Thompson isn't too bad on the ground either, which is what I was saying last week. Both guys are good on the ground. I expected a bit of ground and pound from Bonfim to end this fight, but he wasn't able to finish Stephen Thompson. I'm glad that Stephen didn't get finished, but of course, unfortunately for him, despite having more significant strikes than Bonfim, the takedowns were very efficient to get the scorecard up for him. So good job for Bonfim. Probably a huge win in his eyes, getting a win over Stephen Thompson, even though he's at the back end of his career, of course. And no idea when Stephen's going to stop fighting, but he looks to be in good shape still. And as he said last time he fought, even though he was KO'd by Buckley, I believe, he said that he doesn't feel ready to retire and he'll keep going until his body says no. So we'll see what happens next. Now, of course, we had the main event between Derrick Lewis and Thaleson Teixeira, and there's not really much to say because it didn't happen in a very long period of time at all. Of course, what was disappointing to hear was that a lot of people were criticizing Jason Herzog's stoppage. Now, I would like to give my 2 cents on this, and I probably will do a video just for my TikTok as well on the stoppage, only just concerning the stoppage, of course. But I believe it was a good stoppage, and Thaleson was being beaten down by Derrick Lewis. Of course, the knockdown put him on the ground, and Derrick continued those left and rights, striking as much as he could to get the TKO finish. And at the moment where Thaleson Teixeira was trying to get up, he wasn't just getting up on his own 2 feet. If he was trying to get up on his own 2 feet without any outside interference, he would not have managed to get back up. He knows that. He would have been completely KO'd by Derrick Lewis, because Derrick Lewis would have taking the opportunity whilst his hands were on the ground trying to get up to land even more strikes and KO him completely. So what did he do? He puts his fingers in the fence and tries to get up like that. Of course, that is what we call straight on cheating. So when you cheat like that, I'm sorry, you don't get to then complain about the stoppage. He, of course, was straight up on his feet after the bell was rang, and of course the fight was terminated. A lot of people saying a bad stoppage, early stoppage, blah, blah, blah. Other refs may have left those guys to continue to fight. Other refs would have said, just Thaleson, get your fingers out the cage and continue. And he would have been KO'd probably 5 or 6 seconds later. Jason Herzog saw an illegal move because he was trying to get up. He wasn't able to get up without the fence. He was being dominated and basically receiving a TKO from Derrick Lewis. And Jason Herzog obviously took it upon himself to end the fight at that moment in time. I don't think if we'd have sort of seen much more of that fight, the outcome would have changed. But of course, for a lot of MMA fans and a lot of people, even Dana White, felt like it was a little bit early. But I don't think it was a bit early. I think it was fine. It could have been left. I would have been happy either way. I know the outcome would have been the same. But other refs would have left it, of course, especially Herb Dean. But either way, Derrick Lewis won, of course, fair and square. And in a matter of seconds, of course, the only time you see a guy on the phone when his hand is being raised by the ref at the end of the fight, which was insane, incredible. And whilst he was holding his hand up, of course, whilst he was getting his hand raised, I said to myself, who could be possibly on the phone to Derrick Lewis right now? The phone was, of course, handed by Dana White to someone to give it to Derrick Lewis. Was he really on the phone with someone that important that his hand was raised and he was still on the phone with them, talking to them, seemingly? But then when you find out it was the President of the United States, Donald Trump, you kind of understand, of course, even Dana White would never have told him off because he was the one asking to hand the phone to Derrick Lewis. And apparently Derrick Lewis, once he finished the fight and did his whole celebration fiasco, he looked at Dana White and said, did the president watch me? Is the president here? Is the president seeing this? And Dana was like, he's not here. But Derrick was like, I'm sure he's watching at home. So get him on the phone. And he did. So a real great win for Derrick Lewis. At 40 years old, he's still slamming guys on the ground and, slaying the heavyweight division. He has quite a few opponents, obviously, in front of him if he wants to move back up the rankings. But when asked if Tom Aspinall was a good matchup for him, he said he thinks he would be a great matchup for Tom Aspinall and that he tried to, what was the term? I'll try and knock his head off, he said. So I would be up to see a Tom Aspinall versus Derrick Lewis fight just to see what would happen. It's not even a question of wanting to know who would win or not, or seeing how Tom Aspinall or how Derrick Lewis would win. But of course, I just want to know what happened between those guys, because you never know. Tallis and Texera, as I said earlier, potentially full checked. But also I feel like he was just a little bit too young to be going up against someone like Derrick Lewis with the years and years of UFC experience that he has. So we'll be seeing more from Tallis and Texera, I'm sure. He'll be bulldozing through a lot of other top 15 contenders, I believe, in the UFC heavyweight division, and we'll be seeing him coming up again very soon. So that's all I have to say to you guys about that. Derrick Lewis, I'm very happy for him. Let me know what you thought of UFC's Nashville card, and whether you believe that that was an early stoppage or not from Jason Herzog, and whether you agree with me that it wasn't. In any case, are you guys happy with Derrick Lewis? Do you think that Derrick Lewis versus Tom Aspinall should happen one day? I think so. Why not? In UFC, in MMA, anything can happen. So why not put Derrick Lewis against Tom Aspinall? That would be entertaining to watch. Anyway, so that's it for me. And I hope to see you guys in the coming days for my UFC 318 breakdown and picks. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, like, comment, and subscribe as usual below this video. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.